Today we're going to talk about cybernetics. Does anyone know what cybernetics is? Have you heard of the term cybernetics? Well, I have given you some books to take a look at. They are circulating at the moment. You can take a look. If you like them, you can take a picture. Feel free. Please return them to me afterwards. They're not presents. So I've been studying the history of artificial intelligence for quite a while now, and cybernetics has a particular place in that history. And why history? History because it kind of helps us understand where we are now. Why are we studying what we do today? It helps us situate our work within a broader social context, and perhaps it will give you some tools to think about your own studies and understand some of the questions around critical data science and science and technology studies. How many of you are taking the STS program? Yeah, quite a few. Have we got any anthropologists here? Anthropology? Any psychologists? Literary studies? Languages? Hello, welcome. Come in. I literally just started. Take a seat. Have we got any engineers here? Any mathematicians? Where do you guys come from? Sociology, okay. Digital sociologists, okay. Great. So many social scientists, that's good, great. So have you used the prefix cyber before? As in cyber cafe, now you all know my age, I'm too old. Cybersecurity, cyber defense. So cybernetics, what is it? Many books around the topic. I will give you a warning. This talk and cybernetics itself is very male, very white, very American and Eurocentric. Although, if you're interested, there is an entire side history of Chinese cybernetics I didn't feel too competent to talk about. And it's also very militaristic, but perhaps there is hope for a less militaristic future. But I want to start a little bit before the term cybernetics was invented. I will tell you the story of at least two demons. One's called the Maxwell's demon, the other is called Laplace's demon. If you know a little bit of physics, a little bit of thermodynamics, this might sound familiar. Have you ever heard of René Descartes? As social scientists, that idea of the mind-body dualism. So let's start from there, though the story never starts from anywhere, but let's start from there. So there was this philosopher, mathematician, kind of polymath who said that the body is one thing and you can study it as something that looks like a machine, like an automaton, back in the 1600s. And because he wanted to be friends with the church, he said that the mind is another thing, right? So God will save you, and the mind is something that I don't really bother about when I study the body. So this created lots of confusion. People said, so if the body is one thing and the mind is another thing, that is extremely complex. What we're going to do? So another guy, around 80 years later, Leibniz, my computer is called Leibniz because of this guy, said that essentially everything, doesn't matter if it's mind or body, sort of dissolves into monads. And that kind of inspired this early idea of computation, that everything can be calculated in bits. It either is or isn't. And these sort of formulations of monads, as he called them, are giving up the structure, this sort of metaphysical harmony of everything. The reason that right now everything doesn't collapse is because of these monads, according to this guy. Then there was another guy, 27 years later. He was very radical. He didn't believe in God. He thought that the mind isn't really a thing. All we live here is just a sort of instinct. So the very fact that I see you now, well, forget about it. When I'm dead, I'm dead. It's just the body, and that's what we need to study. And he said that the body is a machine. So because at his time machines became more popular and everyone was trying to create machines, he said that the body is also a machine. So if you're doing medical anthropology, for example, or various types of digital sociology and you're interested in the quantified self, well, that's kind of where it comes from. A few years later, there was this guy from here, from Scotland, Adam Smith. Anyone heard about him? Yeah, some pro-capitalists here, some anti-capitalists here. So that guy said that the government who wants to regulate the people isn't right in doing so, and that the markets and the different interests of the people are self-regulating, right? So that was interpreted some 200 years later as the idea of the free market and neoliberal capitalism and so on. To what extent he thought of these things, I don't know, but I'm not a sociologist by training either. That guy had a student, James Watt, and James Watt was really inspired by him, and he was part, he in part co-created that idea of centrifugal governors, which are essentially these machines on the right, these things that through the power of mechanics are able to control steam and therefore are able to automate many of our works. So there is an open question as to whether James Watt and Adam Smith were having these conversations about whether the body itself is a sort of metaphor for processes of thermodynamics, of air, of water, of steam, and whether governments should follow this example. Now all this kind of culminated into the early 1800 idea of causal determinism, that essentially if we are able to control air and steam through these kind of engines, then we are able to control everything if we know enough about them. Anyone interested in data? Data-driven innovation, big data, yeah, great. So that guy, Pierre-Simon Laplace, physicist, mathematician, at some point suggested that if you give me the exact position of every molecule in the universe, I will be able to predict every future state of the world. And he used the word data because data essentially meant givens, the take for granted kind of thing. So the exact position that can be numerically represented in some form. And a few years later, there was this other guy, again from Scotland, James Clerk Maxwell, who coined that idea of the Maxwell's demon. That's a fancy drawing of the Maxwell's demon, who said that, well, essentially there are two key states in the universe. One is more chaotic, disordered, and the other is more ordered. So his main approach was that our ultimate purpose, essentially, as human beings, is to impose that kind of order in chemical and physical strata. So he imagined a demon. So if you think of molecules, right? If you think, what are molecules? Essentially, they are little entities that move around depending on different speeds, and these kind of speeds determine the temperature. So if you have fast-moving molecules, you have hot water. If you have slow-moving molecules, you have cold water. So if you put the two types of water together, you'll get the same temperature eventually. So he said, imagine a demon who separates the molecules, the fast-moving from the slow-moving, and you have a fridge, a refrigerator, a machine that is able to control the data, the givens, and create some sort of order. That's the once upon a time kind of question, and now we'll need to time travel a bit. These guys have been very, very influential in science. Everyone was talking about order, how we're going to find some viable solutions, how we're going to share information, and so on. World War I happens, lots of weaponry. Who was it, that ancient guy, Heraclitus, who said that war is the father of everything. So because of war, people started becoming very inventive, unfortunately, and created weapons of relatively mass destruction at the time. The Treaty of Versailles was signed, so peace on every side, but then the Second World War happened, so humans thought, well, actually, this kind of treaty thing, it won't work. Wars will keep going on. So there was this kind of tendency to build up technologies and science that are in service of war, and governments were giving lots of funding, lots of sponsorship to investigate these technologies in order to understand information, to access it, to order it, and to devise some universal principles under which things could describe. So one could say that these scientists who developed these early ideas in the 40s that became known as cyberneticians later on, they were curiosity-driven. On the one hand, they wanted to find out these properties, but on the other hand, they were also getting the sponsorship from military organizations. If you read science, if you read papers, if you go on Google Scholar and find these papers, they will appear very scientific. There is no war context. What I'm inviting you to do when you are citing papers in your essays is to look who gave money to these authors that you're citing. And then you can start your sort of sociological journey around the social construction of science. So, taken out of this sort of war and political context, let's take a little look at these three papers because they're very important in order to understand what cybernetics is about. Starts 1943, sort of really World War II sentiment in the air. Walter Pitts and Warren McCulloch write the paper titled A Logical Calculus Immanent in the Ideas of Nervous Activity. Very boring, right? Well, essentially they said that everything that happens in our brain is something like Boolean algebra. Does any of you know Boolean algebra? Have you ever used it? If and or not. So it's either this or the other, or that. It's this and this. It's this, not this. So that was an algorithm from the 1700s. That's essentially how web search started working in the 90s. And they said, it's really, that's how the brain works. Not only that, once you have a sort of, when you see an image or when something important happens in your life, your brain creates a symbol out of it. So all the moments that you've spent in life, for example, fighting with your parents, or a very nice trip here in Edinburgh, or something like that, it slowly becomes a symbol in your brain that you're able to process it. And then you add these symbols, or you negate those symbols, or you compare those symbols, and you create new intellectual processes. That's what they suggested. And in a sense, you can say that this is the origins of contemporary artificial intelligence, of computing commands when you are typing commands on your computer, if you are doing any kind of basic XML, or if you use Python, for example, and also the basis of neural networks. So that idea that brain patterns are sort of simulating step functions and see and build sort of a purpose, which leads to that other paper, same year, Norbert Wiener, Julian Bigelow, and Arturo Rosenbluth, Behavior, Purpose, and Teleology. So they said that if you are an organism, if you are an entity that has a brain and uses this kind of symbolic functions, in order to survive, you need to have a purpose, right? Again, that idea of causal determinism for those of you who might be a little bit into philosophy. So very deterministic, you need to have a purpose, and based on that purpose, you break the process into smaller pieces, smaller tasks, step functions, and that's how the brain operates, and therefore we might be able to simulate that in computers. But what happens, they said, is that you have feedback mechanisms. That's extremely important. So what do you get when your markers are giving you a 55 in your essay? You get feedback, right? That's where it comes from. You get feedback, and then you adjust your purpose. You say, what's my purpose? To get a degree from the University of Edinburgh. I'm going to break that into pieces, right? I'm going to first attend the lectures, then read the literature, then write the essay, and so on. Then I'll become an amazing scholar and breakthrough scientist. Third paper, a few years later, Claude Shannon and Weaver, I forgot to mention him. So that's super important. There's lots of research on that paper. It's a paper, but it's actually like a little book. The version I have is like a book. It's like almost 100 pages. A mathematical theory of communication, where essentially Claude Shannon says that we have a new property in the universe. I see some nods, some people know that already, that's great. Instead of just having energy and matter in the Cartesian kind of speculation, we also have information that is completely separate. When I transmit you that information, when I give these words to you, it's not energy, it's not matter. I give you something else. And Shannon says there are ways to measure that information that are very objective and outside of social context. And this is crucial. This speaks to exactly this Second World War and Cold War sentiment that you can transmit information, say, throughout, while bypassing Germany, you can send information from Poland to the Soviet Union without any sort of contextual interference. So there were different methods for that, and people were competing. How are we going to do that? Today, we're still doing that. So this encryption and decryption. Are you using Signal, or are you using Facebook for your communications? Are you using University of Edinburgh's emails or your own emails? What are you using? The question is the same. Is information the same outside of context? I personally disagree, but I'm happy to receive feedback on that. Okay, so all these people, besides serving all these military interests, they were also very weird and quirky. As you see, they had this sort of gentleman club kind of attitude. There was one woman among them. Does anyone know Margaret Mead? I'm going to place some extra emphasis on Margaret Mead. Anyone? One person on the back knows her. Two. Okay, last time it was more people, but it's no surprise you're not anthropologists. If you were anthropologists, you'd be, Margaret Mead. She's the amazing scholar who went to Papua New Guinea, and she studied all the previously untouched tribes, and she was able to create translations of their language for the first time. Why? Because she used these sort of decrypting mechanisms that she co-developed with these guys called the Cyberneticians. Anyway, so this group was really impressed by all these findings around thermodynamics and information and entropy, and they wanted to, they got sponsorship from the Josiah Macy Jr. Foundation to run a conference every year. The proceedings are circulating there. It's a thick and expensive book that I tempted myself to get a copy of. And they wanted to create what nowadays we would call an interdisciplinary venue to study the common properties of all these things. So they said, is life engineering? Is life physics? Is life anthropology? Is life social science? Is life neurophysiology? Is life psychiatry? Is life psychology? Or maybe is life something beyond all these things? Is there a sort of higher level umbrella term we can invite? We can invent and invite people to follow that regulates these kind of systems. So they focused in the first conference on control and communication. How do you communicate these pieces of information? How do you control your states of being? So they were interested in feedback mechanisms between entities, between systems, and they were interested in how we reach homeostasis. Anyone who remembers the term homeostasis from biology, from high school? Homeostasis, anyone? Okay, it essentially means that as I'm walking, I'm not collapsing. Homeostasis is like, oh yeah, it's cold outside, it's -5, I still preserve my body in a certain temperature. So that's homeostasis. And because of some successful stories, so for example, the invention of the thermostat, essentially a machine that you put in your household and it kind of regulates the inner temperature, that kind of said, well, maybe if we can create these machines, perhaps we can find out more answers through the studying of mechanical replication of these thermodynamic processes. This was eventually known as first-order cybernetics, when entities were studied as part of larger systems. The way these conferences happened, they were a bit different than conferences as you know them. Maybe you've been to a few conferences, maybe you attended a few conferences here in Edinburgh during your stay. So usually you have, at a conference, you have every person talking for 15 minutes, and then you have 5 minutes or 10 minutes of questions. This was very different. Every person would have 5 minutes or 10 minutes of a presentation, a short presentation, and then all the rest would try and bring out responses from their own discipline. So if you were a neurophysiologist and you talked about body regulation systems, you'd have an anthropologist who would say, well, in this society, that's how this is achieved. The same thing, we use a different word, but that's how it's achieved. If it's computer science, well, that's how we do it with machines. If you were a psychiatrist, you would say, well, that's how it happens with interactions between humans. So it was a very promising field. And the guy on the top right, Norbert Wiener, said that we have decided to call the entire field of control and communication theory, whether in the machine or in the animal, by the name Cybernetics, which we take from the Greek Kybernetes, I happen to speak Greek, or steers person, that means the person who controls. Now, if you know a little bit of etymology, cybernetics is the same etymological root as government. It literally means the same. The G and the K are different pronunciations of the same thing, as much as V and B. So it's, when you say government, you refer to the same word as cybernetics. So towards the final conferences, these lasted for 9 years. They had a bit of a disagreement. They didn't really know what this field was for. What was cybernetics' own teleological purpose? So was it about building machines that imitate intelligence and therefore automate the office, automate the environment, create ChatGPT and write your essays with? Was it about understanding what intelligence is? To use GPT and say, well, actually, my brain works a bit like that as well. So perhaps we could do a study on that. Was it about building machines in order to understand intelligence? So use the tools to delve deeper into the brain processes and understand what they are about. or understand intelligence in order to build machines that can emulate it. So Terminator scenarios, or essentially rapid pace, code breaking, things that Alan Turing did. By the way, anyone knows Alan Turing? Yeah, some names. Yeah, of course, everyone knows Turing. Great person. Very interesting. He received a special invitation to join the Cybernetics conferences, and he refused. But he made the equivalent in the UK called the Ratio Club. That is still, a version of it is still available today. I was in one, and I met Alan Turing's nephew, who is a cryptographer as well, and a very interesting chap. This is an example I brought to you because I'll return to this later on in the next hour. So that's an example of how these articles look like. Maturana, will return to him later on. McCulloch, you remember from the neural communications paper from 1943. So these guys did very cruel experiments. They didn't win the Lash Prize for animal-free testing. So they literally took frogs, living frogs, removed their eyes, turned them around to see how they will be able to catch flies. And through that, they deducted that the frog's existence is part of the fly, is also part of the tree, of the plant, of the lake that is its surroundings. Because they found out that even if you remove the visual dimension, the system is still there. So these are the kind of things some of the cybernetics people did. That's another example. That book is also circulating, Designed for a Brain. Ross Ashby was this kind of person. He would dress up like that and go to conferences, so more quirky than your professors here at Edinburgh. So he literally wrote that book that, well, if you want to design a brain, that's how you're going to do it. Now, did he succeed? Well, not directly, but he gave some of the key elements about contemporary computer science. Artificial intelligence. Anyone into artificial intelligence? Yeah. So most of you are going to include the term artificial intelligence in your essay, I'm sure. So some of these people, that person here is Claude Shannon, the mathematical theory of communication guy. When this schism in cybernetics happened, when they didn't agree as to whether cybernetics is about understanding intelligence versus building intelligence, this guy said, no, we need another term. We're going to invent a new kind of field. We're going to call it artificial intelligence. And in order to get sponsorship for a summer school, they said that within one summer, they'll be able to solve the problem of what intelligence is just by asking sponsorship for 10 men, because obviously women did not exist at the time. And they said that the main conjecture was that every aspect of intelligence can so precisely be described that a machine can be made in order to simulate it. So that's the basis of artificial intelligence. If you want to find a definition of artificial intelligence, it's very likely 80% sure you're going to stumble on this definition, although the word itself is not mentioned in that sentence. But that's a nerdy comment. Now compare that to Laplace's demon from the 1800s. So Laplace says an intellect which at a certain moment would know all forces that set nature in motion and all positions of all items of which nature is composed. If this intellect were also vast enough to submit this data to analysis, then nothing would be uncertain for this entity. So we can see the continuity between the 1950s and the 1800s and that early kind of philosophy, the mechanistic or causal determinist philosophy that I spoke about earlier. Now we move forward a bit to the 60s. Anyone here fan of sort of spy movies and sort of film noir, Cold War kind of stuff. A bit boring if you read them at the surface, more interesting the more you delve about. So cybernetics as a term escaped these sort of esoteric confinements of obscure conferences that very few people were able to attend. It became a sort of currency that people would use to sell their things. In the same way that today, maybe you don't know what artificial intelligence is, but you say, I'm going to use artificial intelligence in my startup. Or maybe you don't even know where the word data comes from, but you say, oh yeah, my sociological project is a data-driven innovation project. So in the same way, cybernetics was everywhere. There were tons of books. So for example, that book on psycho-cybernetics was super popular, sort of self-help, early self-help books. At the same time, CIA conducted its first mind control experiments. When we talk about brainwashing as a metaphor, that was the sort of, that's where it came from, when people were subjected to these kind of behaviorist experiments. Have you heard of nudging, for example, these things that the government does to control the sort of potentially criminal behavior of people? That's where it comes from. Psy-ops, that's a very old term, psychological operations, that's where it comes from. It was all paired to this idea of the space race, who's going to go to the moon first, the US or the Soviet Union. And that's the time when intelligence started meaning information. For example, CIA is the Central Intelligence Agency. Intelligence isn't a property of your brain. Intelligence is something measurable. Give me the intel. So you can count it, you can give it to people. It has a sort of material substrate. Anyone here acquainted to the word cyborg? Cyborgs, anime, Ghost in the Shell, Donna Haraway, Cyborg Manifesto. You hate it, you cite it, you hate it. So most people think that cyborgs come from science fiction, but this is not true. The first appearance of the word cyborg is 1960, and it's actually a proposal submitted to NASA by these two people who said that the planet we live on is not very viable. We'll soon need to go somewhere else. We'll need to survive elsewhere, and we'll need to use cybernetic processes of homeostasis to survive in the outer space. So we'll need to become cybernetic organisms, cyborgs. That's where it comes from. These are illustrations from the original paper, and on the upper side you get Spy versus Spy. That was a very famous cartoon in the 60s about spies and all the technologies and tricks they used to communicate or miscommunicate. So essentially, cybernetics during that time in the 60s started becoming synonyms of anything electronic, anything mechanic, anything digital, anything network, and it stopped having this sort of idea of governance and control and communication or systems oriented. Keep in mind that was the time in 1961 when John F. Kennedy won the campaign against Nixon, receiving the assistance of a behavioral data company called Simulmatics that was trying to oppose cybernetics, and therefore called Simulmatics, that created a sort of vast database of demographics about potential voters. So they essentially said to Kennedy, tomorrow you're gonna give a talk to these people, and according to their demographics, they're these kind of people. So according to our cybernetic plan, that's how you have to tailor your speech. And Kennedy won. According to a historian, he won because of that company that applied this sort of cybernetic thinking to demographics. Cybernetic, you might call it today statistical, right? But it's the same philosophy behind. 1964, we've got the launch of the American Society for Cybernetics, potentially countering the Russian, the Soviet cybernetics sort of compartment. So if you're into Russian history, it's very interesting. So the history of the Soviet Union and technology is very interesting. So before Lenin, Stalin was essentially very anti-American. Right, so Stalin said we shouldn't have cybernetics in the Soviet Union because if we do, we serve the capitalists, we serve the Americans. When he died, there were some people who said, well, we can actually use these tools and actually be better than the Americans. So with Lenin, you might have, any of you taken understanding technology? One person, few people. So if you've taken understanding technology, you've probably heard your lecturer talking about Lenin's motto that was communism equals Soviet power plus the electrification of the entire Soviet Union. So this idea of technological determinism, get more technology, doesn't matter where it comes from, no context, no social context in the information, get it and use it. If it's ours, it's ours. In a sense, the same legacy continues until today with Russian torrent websites, Library Genesis, Sci-Hub, where you download all the Western material that are not immediately accessible to you. I use them a lot, but don't tell my boss. On the other side of the planet, in the States, there was lots of anti-Vietnam War sentiment at the same time. It was a sort of Henry Kissinger time, and many people who worked in cybernetics, they thought, why are we doing this? Why are we doing that? We publish all these papers, and essentially they're using it for military purposes, but we don't think like that. In 1969, after the Vietnam War, if we think it ended before 1969, there was this amendment called the Mansfield Amendment that said all money, all sponsorship from now on won't go to curiosity-driven research. It will just go for practical applications of science that have immediate applications in warfare. So many cyberneticians rejected that. Some scientists collaborated with the radical science movement. Essentially, if you've spoken to some elderly members of this university, they belonged in this radical science movement sort of initiative. And that's how some of the departments like ours, the Science, Technology, Innovation Studies, started in the mid-70s. So the question became cybernetics. It sounds so cool. What is it for? Anyone heard of Martin Heidegger? You either love him or hate him, or you know that you either love him or hate him. So he was the existentialist philosopher, very, very interesting. He never flee the Nazi occupation. He stayed there. There is an image of him sort of clearly depicting him in support of the Nazi party, but very influential philosopher. And his main point was that philosophy today is dead. Why? Because it's broken into pieces. Because now you go to the university and you study a set of separate things. You study mathematics and philosophy and literature and physics and all this and that. So philosophy is dead because philosophy was a unified thing in the old times. And when he gave a very apologetic interview with the very famous German newspaper Der Spiegel, the interviewer asked him, so now that philosophy is dead, what will take its place? And his answer was cybernetics. So even Martin Heidegger, that very controversial philosopher, thought that cybernetics, this idea of a science of all sciences, is the future of philosophy. And then we go to the hippies, or second order cybernetics. Remember, the 60s and the 70s were all about psychedelic stuff. So the Beatles, the people in the West starting expressing interest in Oriental philosophies, in Buddhism, in Hinduism, in Zen Buddhism, in Taoism, and so on. So the cyberneticians weren't far away from that. Many of those were passionate sort of Orientalists in a sense. Heinz von Forster, one of the first members, was really active in this sort of schism of cybernetics. So he moved around different laboratories in order to secure funding from non-military institutions, and that's what some scholars call sort of nomadic science, that because of your beliefs, because of the needs that you have, you move around as a scientist looking for better conditions for your curiosity to be expressed. And because of this sort of, because they were influenced by this sort of esoteric, Orientalist, Buddhist kind of meditative practices, they started considering the role of the I, of myself, of the observer within the system. So what is the motivation for studying a system, as opposed to the early cybernetics that was about objective versus of reality? Well, what is our role within the system? How do we interact with systems? How do systems and models interact with each other? So if you have a model that says sexism exists, and men and women are the only genders, and these are the only two that exist, and you have another model that says, no, gender is socially constructed, it's not a binary, it's a spectrum, and so on. How do these models interact? If you are a student who takes courses and you're exposed to both theories by two very different professors, how do you survive in this system? So they started asking these kind of very interesting questions. They started talking about systems within systems and networks within networks. Gordon Pask was a very influential writer of that time. He started trying to build computers that weren't digital, they were analog, that they could transform music into color and color into music, sort of synesthetic kind of approaches. Chemical computers, now they become very fashionable. Chemical computers become fashionable 60 years after Gordon Pask's initial proposals. He started coming in contact with artists and asking them about subjective experience in aesthetics. When we say aesthetics, it means sensing. It comes from ancient Greek for sense, I feel. So people started to think about social cybernetics, of a mix of social science with cybernetics. The guy on the right is Stafford Beer. Besides having a very cool surname, I don't know if he consumed lots of beer, but he wrote a lot about how cybernetics can be applied to organizational theory. You can see him in his sort of lotus position. Is that a lotus position? I'm not sure. But he has this sort of yoga kind of, he met with Brian Eno, if you're into experimental avant-garde music. He went to India a few times, and he was interested in when we design things, when we design, for example, a course, under what state are we organizing it? When you organize your plan to write an essay, under what condition, under what state are you when you do that? Are you in a panicked state? Are you in a calm state? And therefore, what are the results? When you plan to go out for a birthday party, whom you're going to invite? Under what state do you invite people or you not invite? So these kind of everyday questions led Stafford Beer to talk about viable systems models that are able to reproduce and sustain themselves. He wrote a very influential book called Brain of the Firm. Obviously, he had to make some money, so he was writing this kind of books that could be applied in sort of organizational settings. But he was also hired by Salvador Allende. Anyone aware of Salvador Allende in Chile? Okay, not so much into 1970s history of Latin America, but Salvador Allende was a very radical leftist governor of Chile, and he hired Stafford Beer to design a cybernetic government that starts from the people, so sort of communist ideal in the most, let's say, romantic way that we can use the word communism, and takes into consideration environmental factors, sort of monetary structures and factors, financial, philosophical, everything. He failed. Why? Because Salvador Allende Salvador Allende's sort of governance was terminated in a very sad way. You can read Chilean history on your own on that. So the question then towards the end of this sort of time was it a communist cybernetics? Was it a fascist cybernetics taken over by the right wing and the military? Was cybernetics about equality in the network? Everyone is equal if we have a network, or was it about controlling the network? Sort of see the network and control it. Can equality transform into dictatorship, the dictatorship of the proletariat, and so on? Well, if you want to know, like, hit subscribe, and let me know in the comments. These were how some of these models look like. So that's the late Stafford Beer, when he reflected even more on all these processes. So he says it starts with the neuron. Understand the neuron, then you have the ganglion, the plexus system in the brain, the cerebrum, then you have your neighborhood. You have the community, you have your own profession, so a trade union across the world, so similar professions connected. You have Gaia and the entire cosmos. So he became very sort of mystical, but also political. And this kind of multi-level thinking influenced many other domains. So that's my own finding. It doesn't mention the word cybernetics in there, but it's a book about trade unions in the 80s. And you can see that sort of systems thinking infiltrated in everything. Do you remember the guy with the frog, Maturana, that I mentioned earlier? And perhaps after that we can go for a little break. So he, towards the end of his life, he became a fully blown Buddhist. That's Lamaist Buddhist in particular. And he became quite mystical. One of his most famous books, co-authored with Francisco Varela, who was also Chilean, was called Tree of Knowledge, and it was published by Shambhala Publishing, that were publishing books on occultism. But this book, Tree of Knowledge, is taught in nearly every sort of organizational theory kind of course, because it gives a sort of broad spectrum of how systems work at an organizational, environmental, psychological, anthropological, sociological level. He talked a lot about autopoiesis, autopoiesis, that means self-creation. So this sort of homeostatic system that controls complexity and is able to survive. They were interested in structural genesis. So for example, a zebra with its patterns, its beautiful patterns, or a drop in the ocean that creates those patterns. How are these structures created? This amphitheater, so beautiful with its chairs and its students and so on. What creates this kind of structures and patterns that repeat themselves in various instances? And what creates the opposition to them? So they asked these very deep questions that became very relevant in various aspects of economics and organizational theory. That image of the frog slowly becoming human, or human becoming frog, is from his book. They mention the experiments. They don't mention why they use that image. I think that he, because of the later on Buddhism, he wanted to allude that essentially we shouldn't do those experiments after all 40 years ago, but I don't know. Let's take a break now. And I'm always open to questions if you want to come here in those 5 minutes. So in this second part of the lecture, we're going to talk a bit more about how this idea of cybernetics escaped sort of confinements of the laboratory, and it attached itself to very different sort of frameworks and fields and domains. So if you think of systems, again, and if you think of systems of systems of systems, you might think of our planet as a system. So in 1965, there was this guy you might have heard of, James Lovelock, who, alongside Lynn Margulis, developed this idea of the Gaia hypothesis that became extremely popular, especially in the 70s. You can still find contemporary Penguin Classics editions of that book. And I'll return to how it became very influential to today's discourses, and in part in what you're studying here at this digital sociology or science technology studies or social science and sustainability programs. But before that, I want to stay a little bit on Gregory Bateson. So very few of you knew Margaret Mead, but Margaret Mead was married to Gregory Bateson, so they attended these early cybernetics conferences together. They influenced each other very much. So Bateson was the son of a very famous biologist, William Bateson, who was in correspondence with some important people here in Edinburgh, but that's another story. So he was trying to find out important sort of frameworks to describe the human mind, and inspired by his wife's anthropological findings and his colleagues, Norbert Wiener's findings in engineering, he developed a number of theories to help mental health patients to navigate their existence through schizophrenia. So inspired by metacognition, for example, how we invent those meta rules. So for example, play. When two children or two dogs bite each other, but they don't actually bite each other, this is a condition of metacognition, right? And he said, very often we are exposed to very sort of contradictory commands in life. You have a parent that says, I love you, and another parent that hits you. You have one marker that says, you've written an amazing essay that's a 70. You have another marker that fails you. And he says that constant repetition of these processes creates schizophrenia. How this came from, that's a bit of an anecdote. I was very proud when I found out about it. He was in conversation with Norbert Wiener, and because they were joking a lot with each other, he asked Norbert Wiener, okay, how are you going to turn a telephone network schizophrenic? And Norbert Wiener said, well, you need to give it two contradictory commands at the same time, and that will block the entire network. So he says, that's probably how the human mind works as well. Towards the end of his life, he started thinking about the planet and environmentalism, and what do we do in our everyday communications that can help sort of change the planet towards a better situation. He started with a thermostat. He said that in the same way that externally there's lots of cold, but you can change the internal bias of your house, and you can preserve a certain temperature through this sort of interaction of fuel and temperature and breathing and action and so on. It's up to us to change our politics in order to have a better environment for ourselves. So things become more environmentalist. That's the model he used, which if you find me late at a pub, I always have it downloaded with me, and usually the conversation will lean towards me showing you this model. It's a circular kind of thing. Let's start with war. Through war, you have incentive to develop technology. Technology has pollution as its side effect, but then technology has very positive outcomes, for example, health and life expectancy. So there is a population growth. Population growth means famine as a side effect. People become hungry, people compete, and because people compete, people become very arrogant, they commit hubris, and then there is war again. So that's Gregory Bateson's environmentalist, activist, political kind of thing. He tried to inspire people to change the biases in these kind of social thermostats, if you want to call them that. Have you heard the boomer kind of saying that, well, the 70s was a different time? It was a different time, maybe it wasn't, I don't know. So cybernetics started infiltrating, although many people associate cybernetics with science fiction, it was in the 70s that cybernetics entered science fiction. Actually, if you wanted to survive as a science fiction author in the 70s and in the 80s, you would have to make a reference to cybernetics, cyborg, something cyber. One of my favorite books, the Illuminatus trilogy by Robert Anton Wilson and Robert Shea, asks that Marx should have known his cybernetics before writing The Capital, but he wasn't lucky enough to have cybernetics in his times. In the early 80s, we've got William Gibson talking about cyberspace in one of his short stories, and that's where the idea of the cyberspace came from. So internet, society, and economy. Many other authors, maybe you've read some Ursula K. Le Guin, some C.J. Cherry, or my absolute favorite, Thomas Pynchon. They all refer to entropy, thermodynamics, cybernetics, cyborgs, and so on. The cyberpunk movement, anyone heard of cyberpunk or steampunk? These ideas derive from cybernetics. And the main idea was that through literature, through science fiction, you give people inspiration to look into computers and become punks, sort of anti-authoritarian agents that are able to self-teach themselves how to program, how to compute, and then enter the big computational systems from the government, hack them, and give the information to the people. Any of you studying the metaverse? Very popular 2 years ago. Now nearly no one talks about it. Few people talk about it. Good. So we tend nowadays to study the metaverse as something technological and scientific. The metaverse was a science fiction invention from the early 90s by a guy called Neil Stephenson, very, very interesting author. He actually consulted some cybernetics experts from the University of Edinburgh to write his book on the metaverse. And essentially, the metaverse wasn't something good in the book. It was something like in the film The Matrix. So there is a Japanese pizza delivery person called Hero Protagonist who hacks into the system and chops everyone around. Anyway, that's a sort of little 1980s Russian cartoon I can recommend you watching called The Miracles of Technology, where we can see images of how the prospective kind of robots would do your homework, will write your essays, and so on. That screenshot on the right is my own picture. I searched ChatGPT homework, and now it's quite part of our everyday life, I guess. So from this sort of Orientalist dream and the sci-fi kind of sentiment, we get to this sort of blend where we increasingly lose sense of what is fiction, what is reality, and there was this very influential guy called Timothy Leary. I don't know if anyone's into his writings anymore. Back when I was a student, it was like a must. You had to read Timothy Leary if you wanted to be cool. So in the 60s, he was hired by the CIA to conduct this kind of weird psy-ops experiments. He started experimenting with LSD, taking lots of LSD himself, very psychedelic experience. Then he ended up in jail because he wrote some scientific articles about the positive effects of LSD. Don't try this at home. After that, when he saw the sort of computational cybernetic technologies proliferating, and when he saw the first networks, the first communication from different parts of the planet through the internet, he said, I was completely wrong about LSD. This is not going to bring the liberation, but the internet will. So he started talking about cyberdelics, that if the ultimate purpose of, say, LSD in the 60s was to transcend the self, to be the sort of Tibetan Buddhist idea of negation of the self, I am not, then this can be done through the internet. Since right now I can communicate with millions of people, that means I am not myself anymore, but at the same time I am somebody. So he was very influential with his writings, lots of documentaries, very interesting guy. And he also influenced contemporary debates around the singularity. Anyone writing about the singularity, that idea that robots will become conscious, or we can upload our minds online. When he was about to die, when he found out he had cancer, he wrote one last book called Design for Dying. Again, this sort of cybernetic kind of thinking about designing how you're going to die. And he considered all options. He said, I don't want to get buried. I could do cryonics, so I could preserve myself sort of in a massive fridge. Or, he said, you could cremate me and upload everything I've written, all of my videos, all of my pictures on the internet, and I will be immortal. So he coined that idea that you can upload yourself. He believed that. Excellent. Cybernetics then also influenced law and management studies. If you are into German theory, German law, Niklas Luhmann was a very influential cybernetics legal scholar. Systems theory, everything is systems of systems of systems in law. If you're into Michel Serres, the parasite, very big in social theory in the 80s. Essentially, the parasite is a communication signal parasite. What we talked when we... Do you have a TV at home? Cable TV, anyone? So when you get this sort of signal, sort of white noise, that's the parasite. But Serres said that you can also have more metaphors of the parasite. So a parasite and a host, or everyone being a parasite. Parasites within systems. And he was very much influenced by cybernetics. Anyone here using actor network theory? Bruno Latour? Not so many? Or maybe you, yeah, a little bit, yeah, here and there, you're afraid. Yeah, well, so that's also influenced by cybernetics. Latour was responding to the cybernetics fashion of the time. His last book before he died was called Facing Gaia. And he was referring to James Lovelock's idea of Gaia, of the Earth as a cybernetic system. And he said, we need to stir at it. So if Lovelock said that we are part of Gaia as a system and we need to switch our biases according to Bateson, then we need to distance ourselves a bit and be the actors in the network and understand how the network works. So even that is influenced, even STS, so critical of cybernetics, is also influenced by cybernetics. Donna Haraway's The Cyborg Manifesto. I know many of you like to cite it. I always try to avoid citing it and recommend others to not to cite it, essentially because Donna Haraway herself admitted that she was too much influenced by cybernetics at the time. So she written at least 2 other manifestos since then, and you could cite those. It influenced language. So cybernetics became so popular that if you wanted to be popular in the 80s and the 90s, you would have to invent a word that sounded a bit like cybernetics. Psychodynamics, simulmatics, dianetics, cryonics, macrobiotics, biometrics, radionics, synoetics, all these were tacit references to cybernetics. Everything that has the prefix cyber cafe, it meant internet cafe. But there's entire literature about the 90s and cyber cafes. Why do we call them cyber? Well, because of cybernetics. Operationalized cybernetics. There's another strand beyond the sort of fringe popular culture cybernetics that absorbed cybernetics as part of an operational instrumentalized process. Again, on the right, you'll see my own Google search recommendation from yesterday or 2 days ago. I asked list of cyber. And what I get is list of cyber attacks, cyber threats, cyberpunk main missions. I think that's a reference to a video game or something else. List of cyber crimes, list of Cybermen episodes, and list of cyber essentials certified something. So people get certificates about their knowledge of cyber essentials, which is interesting. So this knowledge of systems and how systems operate is deeply embedded into contemporary security, managerial, legal research. One of the most influential journals, Operational Research, 30% of the articles is about cybernetics, and there is something about cyber in their title. Any of you coming from the applied sciences or engineering doing cyber physical systems? I once met a few people who did cyber physical systems, and when I asked them, okay, so what do you do? They said cyber physical systems, and it was interesting because by cyber, they mean digital, and with physical, they mean non-digital, but cyber isn't about digital per se, so it was like, damn, etymology. There's another strand, the anti-authoritarian cybernetics, which is also interesting. I always start with St. Jude or Judy Millen, self-taught programmer in the late 60s, one of the first sort of publicly known women in computing, who played an active role in sort of researching and empowering women in computing. She went to jail a couple of times because of protests. That's actually her jail card. And she wrote a few books about women in computer science and the joy of hacker sex. And she inspired lots of people to hack into systems and not only that, but also claim their political rights through access to information. So the main dream was that because, again, Cold War, information and intelligence are entities that can be encrypted, kept from the other party. This sort of early cyber feminist approach was about the information you don't know as a person of color, a woman, a gay person, a marginalized member of a community, is accessible to you if you know how to hack that information. 1991, we have the VNS Matrix Cyber Feminist Manifesto. There is a slide on that in the right after. We've got, what's his first name? Thomas Swan, who completed his PhD here in Edinburgh, writing about anarchist cybernetics, essentially how people use cybernetic methods without even knowing it sometimes to organize and create radical movements. And that's a very recent book from last year, the Anti-Oculus Manifesto from a podcast group called Acid Horizons. I read from the first page. Cybernetics is the interdisciplinary science of control and communication. One can use cybernetics as a science to build social machines of control, and one can use cybernetics to analyze the machinations of productions that attempt to direct and govern social reality. So that idea that Cybernetics is a somewhat objective tool. Not necessarily sure about that, but you can impose your politics on it and use it for different purposes. That's the VNS Matrix Manifesto. I'm not going to read because there are some prohibited words, but the slide is there for you to explore. Aesthetics and cybernetics. So if some of you knew cybernetics in the first 5 minutes of this talk today, you probably thought of a certain aesthetic, of a retro technology. Anyone into vaporwave, listening to vaporwave? I used to start my lectures with some vaporwave songs. So it's this sort of intentional, it looks like 1980s, 1970s, sort of cybernetic network machines, old computer graphics kind of thing. So cybernetics attracted artists since day one. They were curious, what is that thing? What do these people promise? Like, artists love these kind of things because art, if you translate it as craft, as something that is artificial, since the ancient times, it has been associated with the debate whether art is about creating something new, about imitating, about deceiving, about trickery, maybe a combination of these things. Different artists do different things, right? If I'm a realist painter, hyper-realist, if I make a deep fake that is sort of indistinguishable from the real thing, is this a form of art? So huge debate around that. And with cybernetics, you had these questions since day one. One of the books that was circulating, or is still circulating, I'm not sure, it's called Information Theory and Aesthetic Perception. And that guy, Abraham Moles, I think he was French. He was part of the French cybernetics movement, and he was trying to use cybernetics to situate different works of art according to different maps of complexity. I think I've got, yeah, these are his diagrams. I'm not asking you to read any of those, but for example, on the table on the left, he was using examples of very complex painters, such as Hieronymus Bosch or Salvador Dali, whereas the lesser the complexity is, well, semantic complexity versus aesthetic complexity, you get things like abstract painting, so less information. So it's sort of aesthetic complexity as something that is open to subjective interpretation. If you see a black square on a white background that can have many meanings, it means something completely different to every person. Whereas if you have a sort of semantic complexity, many characters, it still means a lot according to Moles, but it's more specific. So it's this dream of describing aesthetic perception as a cybernetic process. And likewise, sound, complexity in sound. These are the one on the right. I think it's now used a lot in contemporary generative AI music software. I think Mole was pioneering in that back then. 1965, there was, in your stay in Edinburgh, have you been to Tate Modern in London? Sort of contemporary art gallery. Back in 1965, there was an exhibition called Cybernetic Serendipity, where an amazing art historian, Jascha Reichardt, who is still alive, you can find her on LinkedIn. She never responded to my messages for an interview. She curated this, she brought together roboticists, cyberneticists, art critics, artists, and they co-created this amazing exhibition. So people were asking these fundamental questions we are still asking. If a machine produces something randomly, what do we make out of it? Our lives dominated by cybernetic machines, what do we make of our lives? How can we escape? So these questions were there. More recently, we had this edition, the Cybernetics of the Poor, sort of, again, this sort of sentiment that we can create art inspired by cybernetic thinking, and speak about politics. What about cybernetics today? I did a search just before this lecture. This is slightly different from what you have on Learn. I'm going to ask Vicky and Morgan to upload the final version. I keep changing these things all the time. So I did a search on the nth order of cybernetics, because some years ago with a friend we were discussing about what if there was a third order of cybernetics, like because we have the first order, the second order, is there a third? And I found out that there is this guy who published an article 3 years ago about meta-cybernetics and how many systems can you have within a system. And I found out that he's talking about sort of policy futures, coordination, different levels of feedback, so it becomes nicely complex. Now, since 2021, that article has 17 citations. Why isn't it more popular? Well, my answer is that we have other things, right? So since 2002, for example, we've got this model over there. And if you do social science, if you do social policy, you might have recognized that model already. That is a multi-level perspective system, very, very influential in sustainability studies, in policy studies, in technology transitions theory, and it has no reference to cybernetics at all. But if you've taken that lecture, if you attended this lecture, you recognize cybernetics immediately. You've got all the social groups, you've got the market user preferences, the industry, the policy, the technology, the science, the culture. You've got the new innovators kind of trying to squeeze into the landscape. You've got some failed ones. You've got the new paradigm from plastic straws to paper straws, or from metaverse terminology to virtual reality terminology, or from feminism to post-feminism, whatever the context is. But you've got this sort of systems theory. And why, for example, that article isn't popular? Well, because some people around 20 years ago got tired of cybernetics. Cybernetics is either too sci-fi, unrealizable dreams, or too militaristic, too much, too very, very American, very operational, and so on. So some carry-home messages for you. I think cybernetics is interesting. You obviously sort of see how passionate I am when I talk about this. It's not just about machines, so next time you see some sort of cyber prefix, you can always play smart and say, well, it's not just about that, it's more, it's much more. It's a very tempting way to view the world, maybe more than one way. It has influenced and was influenced by politics, science fiction, culture, philosophy. It's a not so visible part of our everyday world. So all the digital things we do, if you trace them back, there is some connection to cybernetics, some of the original papers, and so on. And then the question is up to you. What do you think about all this? How it relates to your own work, to your own essays, to your own understanding of the web? Beyond the university confinements, how does this resonate with you as human individuals? How do you relate to your flatmates, to your pets, to the animal you see when you visit the zoo, to the planet, to your sustainable practices? What would make a cybernetics for the 21st and 22nd century? I'm going to open the floor to questions because we've got 20 minutes. But before that, I have a rap song to play for you that has a reference to cybernetics.
Cybernetics, better to shred it with alphabetic words surge from the clouds
to rain down the sound
on the battleground.
Simply spit material, killings labeled a serial,
revealing a metaphysical miracle.
walking water like the Holy Father.
What? As the mental manifest, sharp points the stick, knocks our propensity for dead, and the enemy stepping, we reward weaponry.
The verbal pedigrees for next century. Preconceived through the spirit of the movement, verbal soul control. I train my body to walk over hardcore. House calls, protocol, subjected, chance to intercept it. When I said it, be a speaker, I let it set it in seconds. Leave an image created, heavy weighted, anticipated, equation, quadio, formulated, updated the revelations. My penetration through your mental concentration, leave your body mad frustrated and even be speaking statements. It's my time in one rhyme, reenact the aftermath through paragraphs and put my name upon the map with battle raps. This battle cat, I'm up to bat, I'm cracking back to bring the end of them, sending them side to side like in vertical pendulum. So don't be telling them a message in the bottle, throttle, 7 seeds. Enemies with white flags, up from the seas. Pause and observation, process thoughts when I behoove ya. Pop tops for hard thoughts to rock spots. Verbally a paradox, unlocking Pandora's box. Releasing my darker thoughts, fatter than Mr. Hitchcock. A blister, tongue twister when I hit ya. Overloaded system, blowing single spin transistor. In the mist, while reciting I throw lightning. Clash of the overly excited fucking titans.
No, I am the master. You are the slave. You are in my power.
What is thy bidding?
Hey yo, quick quote, doctor, you ought not drop a fishing line into the depths of this.
And by the way, if you want to write your essays on any of these topics, my email is always open. My inbox is always open for questions, suggestions on literature, and so on. And of course, if there are no questions, I won't keep you here, maintaining that awkward silence. It's already too late. Most of us have been awake for a long time. I'm going to be here for some time, but oh yeah, a question over there. My definition of cybernetics. Thank you very much for that question. So I guess it's a field. I won't say it's a science. It's a field that studies systems. I would give a very simple definition because.
You gave the one that fits in everyone.
Sorry?
You gave the one which fits in everyone.
Yep. Yeah. It's interesting. So if you ask about definitions, part of my research, my personal research, is about how definitions are socially constructed. But also, so part of the model I use is that you've got the definition, an existing definition of something, name it, big data, artificial intelligence, cybernetics, physics, anything that is. You've got the expectations around it, what will happen with this thing, with this definition. What is the future of cybernetics? So why are you using that definition? How do you want to speak to that definition, either to verify or to reject it? Then you have the policy that regulates that type of thing. If it's artificial intelligence, if it's cybernetics, if it's cybersecurity, what kind of governmental laws or sort of other types of governance regulate what we think about that thing. And then you have the sort of individual or smaller group motivations for doing that. All these might shape the definition. So, for example, what happens now with the Artificial Intelligence Act in the European Union. So far, artificial intelligence was escaping definitions. There was a saying that every time AI achieved something, it wasn't considered to be AI anymore. if you showed that system, that computer system, to an AI person from the 50s, they'd be like, that's AI. It does what a human would do using intelligence, so it's artificial intelligence. But we don't consider that AI by any means. Now that there is a document signed by so many people, regulating so many people, what AI is, what the definition is, and what companies have to abide by in order to use AI in their products, AI scientists who did something else will rebrand what they do. So they will not call it AI in order to continue doing what the regulation says is prohibited. So definitions change, and perhaps there is a reason that we don't use cybernetics anymore, because it's so broad that it managed to escape this kind of regulatory, although aspects of it are regulated. So there is specific regulation for cybersecurity, cyber defense, cyber weapons, and so on. So these have to be regulated. But cybernetics, can you regulate it? It's ironic, because cybernetics is about regulation in the physics sense, and the system, the regulation of systems work. But itself, it defies regulation. Yep.
Just a question about that. I wonder, what do you think about the relationship between the cybernetics and this time and space? It's break the original space-time pattern and construct a new space-time order.
That's a super deep question. I wish I was a quantum physicist to answer. I would say that cybernetics. So that guy. That guy on the very first bullet point, Heinz von Forster, I recommend reading his papers. So remember that cybernetics was around the time when every magazine would have an image of Einstein, right? So it was space-time relativity theory, became very popular. Everyone used that, used popular versions of it. Von Forster was, to my best knowledge, the first person who wrote a paper on memory, brain memory, as a quantum mechanic process. So I was looking at the magazine New Scientist yesterday, and there was a proposal that the brain is using is essentially a quantum computer. And that essentially memory is stored through quantum mechanical processes. So I would say, if you consider space-time as a quantum property, as something that is uncertain, and that in different sort of moments or spaces, in time-space or space-time, depending where you want to put the suffix, I think that essentially cybernetics was placed as a sort of navigation principle. They didn't talk a lot about space-time or time-space, because they considered that a complexity problem that they wanted to navigate through. So that would be my very freestyle kind of answer. But you can write an essay on that, but don't submit it to this course, because nobody will be able to assess it. You can send it to Ben Collier, who teaches understanding technology, and then I will buy him a beer for that. Because he studied as a physicist when he was young. Yeah.
In the beginning, you gave us a reminder that this talk will be very male-white and Western-centric. So is it necessary or possible to avoid this tradition or tendency when researching this topic nowadays? And how to avoid it?
This is a very important question. So for people in the back who haven't heard, possibly, your colleague asked whether it is possible to study this topic or other internet-related topics while avoiding the very male-centric, very white and Western-centric bias that exists in the history of cybernetics. So, in my view, it's always good to acknowledge that this was part of history, but there's loads of room for research to find out about what we sometimes call unsung heroes, so people who haven't been given proper credit. So, for example, when I decide to include a little paragraph about St. Jude, I change the bias. But that's me doing that. I intentionally do that because I want to say, you know, there were women there. We don't know much about them. There were trans people as well. Like I said, there's an entire literature that I haven't been through about cybernetics in China. In 1958, there was a cybernetic society in China, but I haven't found a book in English to read about. So there are ways, and history we learn. At least when I went to school, we learned that history is one thing, that it moves like that. No, history is written by so many different people, and sometimes it's up to us to investigate, find this information, these pieces of information that have been stored perhaps in a different format. If you search about something on Facebook, maybe it's not on Facebook, maybe it's on Xiaohongshu, maybe it's on TikTok. Oh yeah, I know Xiaohongshu. And I know you're rating the course on Xiaohongshu, so feel free to rate that course, it's the best. So history is written in many different ways, and on the one hand, you can acknowledge that maybe the history at this time when, you know, the images speak for themselves. You have all these gentlemen and one woman. So if this is our version of cybernetics, it's very male and white dominated. But maybe it goes back to the question about definitions. What if, for example, these 1980s and 70s people, you know, they said, cybernetics, hey, you kind of reinvent the wheel here. If you look at Oriental paradigms, if you look at Zen Buddhism, if you look at Hinduism, it's networks all the way down. So we simply reinvent something. So maybe they didn't call it cybernetics, they didn't even call it systems. They call it something else. They could call it samsara. They could call it nirvana. So entropy, information, you know,